Professor Dame Rachel Griffith. So if you don't know already, Professor Griffith is a Professor of Economics at the University of Manchester. She's also the Research Director at IFS in London, and also currently, if I'm not wrong, Editor of Journal of Political Economy. So very highly prestigious, all positions, one of the top British economists in the world. So we're very pleased today to have Rachel. It's going to be a long day for you, so I hope it's, I hope you'll be engaged in very engaging lecture, and if you have any questions, please do raise it, Rachel, and we're very happy to answer. And that's it.
Great.
Rachel.
Thanks very much for the invitation and for being here. It's great. Singapore's lovely, if not hot. So this is the Griliches lecture. So I thought I'd start by telling just my brief personal story of Zvi Griliches, who was a wonderful man, who this lecture is named after. My very first talk, when I was still a PhD student, Zvi was in the audience. It was in London, and I made the mistake. I was sitting next to him while we were listening to one of the first speakers, and he leaned over to me and he said, "I really get bored hearing all these talks, and I really wish I had one of those shepherd's hooks so that I could just drag the person off the stage when they were boring me." And this was my first talk as a PhD student. I was standing up next, and I was absolutely terrified. But luckily it went well, and Zvi was very nice, and he was absolutely a lovely man, and he was, made a lot of, he had a big impact on my thinking about economics and career. And so it's great that there's a lecture series in honor of him. Despite that story, he was very kind and nurturing to young students. Not if they said stupid things, but if you said good things. And so this is a picture of him. Okay, so what do I want to, so these three lectures together, I'm going to try and talk about, I'm going to base it around three of my papers that I've written, but I'll try to make reference to a broader literature that is really trying to push forward the way we can understand how some types of policies affect market outcomes and welfare in the end, what we care about. So I'm thinking about a class of policies that maybe that apply to sin goods. So I'm going to use the term sin goods to think about goods that people overconsume, and that overconsumption has negative, that some people overconsume, and that overconsumption has negative consequences both on other people, externalities. So it may lead to like increased healthcare costs or increased crime or things that are classic externalities. But importantly, also may lead to internalities. So consequences for that person themselves later on in their life. So if you think of a child thinking about eating too much candy, that may lead to that child not doing as well at school because they kind of are a little, had too much sugar and are a bit hyper and don't pay so much attention, or to longer term health consequences. And when that child's taking that decision, they're not fully accounting for those future costs. So it's like externalities, but it's like on yourself in the future. So why is it interesting to distinguish those? Because some of the consequences of thinking about the impact of policy and the welfare consequences, and particularly if we think about like regressivity issues, are going to be different if the consequences are on you yourself in the future as opposed to on somebody else at this moment in time. So these types of governments are interested in intervening in these types of markets, like tobacco, alcohol drinks, sugary drinks more recently, and unhealthy foods in general, because they have the ability to increase welfare. If government can effectively lead to a reduction in consumption that has those externalities or internalities, then those policies can lead to improvements in welfare. And that motivates a whole bunch of policies like corrective taxes, regulations to the availability and advertising of some types of goods, and then incentives to reformulate. I met yesterday with some people in the Department of Health here, and my understanding is that's quite an active policy area in Singapore at the moment. The government is engaged in some kind of regulations around some types of unhealthy foods. So the reason it's interesting, though, to think about more carefully, and a lot of what I'll be paying attention to, is that these policies have the potential to improve welfare, but they also have the potential to reduce welfare. if what they do is impose costs on people without leading to reductions in internalities and externalities. And a really important feature of this is that these sin goods, not everyone overconsumes them. I like to have a glass of wine with dinner, but I tend to have a glass of wine and that's it. And there's no negative consequences of that on anyone. One of my co-authors runs marathons and he might drink a Coke before he runs the marathon. There's absolutely nothing wrong with him doing that. There's no negative externalities or internalities to that. But more importantly, there may be some places where we really impose big costs on particularly lower income people without any positive benefits. And so the welfare consequences could actually be negative. In addition, we need to be careful to think about what these policies will do to the market equilibrium in the long run. So we may want to, maybe intuitively we may think that restricting advertising would lead to lowering consumption, but I'll show you in lecture 2 that that's not obviously true. And it's very easy to think about ways that the market new equilibrium may actually lead to changes in other strategic variables like prices that would lead to increases in consumption. So the two kind of main themes of what I want to talk about is, one, we really need to think carefully about how we think about consumer heterogeneity in responsiveness when we think about empirically asking what the impact of these types of policies are. And two, we really want to think about the way the market is going to re-equilibrate, not just the direct effect of the policy, but the indirect effect through a new equilibrium. And so I want to talk about some of the tools and developments in economics literature over the last 20 years or something that have allowed us to get a better understanding of this, and the kind of talk about some of the details of what one might want to think about in particular applications, and some of the potential pitfalls that arise. So what are the kind of questions I'm going to ask are, how effective are these types of policies that are aimed at sin taxes? What are the direct and indirect effects of the policies? Do they discourage the socially costly consumption as opposed to just increasing the cost of all consumption, including and so what are the welfare implications, and who gains and who loses? So what are the kind of distributional consequences? And then could we also design better policies that are more effective at discouraging socially costly consumption at lower cost? So what's the effect of the policies that people are actually implementing and thinking about, but then what more could we do? And so all of the empirical approaches I'm going to talk about are ones where we want to learn about these questions ex ante, before the policy has been introduced. So there's a lot of work on the evaluation of policies once policies have been introduced. That's great, super important literature, lots of advances in our ability to do that. What that allows you to do is to learn about how that policy affected some outcomes. It doesn't allow you to disentangle why that policy had an effect, or how a policy that we haven't yet introduced might have an effect, or how we might be able to improve that policy in ways to make it more effective. So I'm going to be thinking entirely about ex ante evaluation. Some of the policies I'm looking at have been implemented, and I have done ex ante, post evaluation, looked afterwards at what the effect of those policies were. But today I'm going to talk entirely about how do we learn before. So how do we help advise governments on how to think about implementing these policies? So the 3 lectures are going to kind of follow on from one another. So the first one's going to be about what's the effect of sin taxes. So anything about taxes on alcohol and taxes on soft drinks, which have been implemented in a lot of countries, and particularly paying attention to how we learn about whether those types of taxes lead. So lots of evidence shows that those taxes lead to reductions in aggregate consumption, but are they leading to reductions in the socially costly consumption? So are they leading to the people who are creating the most externalities and internalities, as opposed to just aggregate consumption? And so that's going to really be thinking about the flexibility in the demand model that we estimate that would allow us to capture that heterogeneity well. The second lecture, then I'm going to look at the policies about restricting advertising of snack foods. That's a policy that I think you have some in Singapore and maybe you're thinking of extending. And so again, that's going to be thinking about empirical approaches to allowing flexibility in demand that allows us to capture those effects of advertising. So there's going to be some additional tricky things to think about there, kind of more in the behavioral field, to think about how we want to model advertising changing people's behavior and to ensure that our demand models allow us to capture that flexibility. There's also going to be some tricky things to do with thinking about how we evaluate welfare when we have these potentially behavioral effects where people's decision utility may differ from their kind of experience utility, and so we'll talk a bit about that. And then the third lecture, I'm going to talk about some current work I'm doing that's not published yet, that is about trying to bring these two together and look at how taxes and advertising interact with each other and how we think about modeling that, and that will bring some new empirical challenges. Okay, so so all of this work has been done with some wonderful colleagues. Pierre Dubois, Martin O'Connell, and Kate Smith are pretty much co-authors on all of the work I'm talking about. So before I start, on my website, rachelgriffith.org, I've put already a reading list that has references to all the stuff I'm talking about, and these slides will be up there by the end of today. So feel free to take pictures, but they'll be up there for you to download. I just didn't do it this morning because didn't get up in time, but they will be up there by the end of today. And please ask questions. No questions too stupid. Despite my story about Zvi, that was probably a really bad story to start with. but please do stop and ask any kind of question you want. So as I said, in all of the talks, I'm going to basically draw from one or two papers, and I'll tell you which paper I'm drawing from. I'm not going to go through the paper in detail. I'm going to highlight one or two aspects of it that are trying to draw out this general theme I'm doing in each of these. All of those papers, the published papers, are all online, like with all the software code that you can download. So if this is an area that you work in and you kind of want to know more about the technicalities of how you actually implement some of these methods, some of this kind of new modeling and new econometrics, the best way to do that is to download the code and use that to learn how to do that. And so most journals, though embarrassingly not the JP, but most journals do require people now to put code up, and so we always do that for all of our papers. Okay, so I'll start with talking about syntaxes and ask the question, so there's a lot of papers that try and evaluate the impact of alcohol taxes and soda taxes, which are the two I'll talk about, that look at the impact of taxes that have been implemented. So what I want to do here instead, though, is look at, we did this prior to the UK's introduction of a soda tax, is to ask how well, an alcohol tax, is to ask how well they target those people that have the biggest externalities and internalities. And so the point of that is that, that's next slide. So what's the distribution of, so in order to ask that question, I need to think about a couple things. So first of all, I need to think about what is the distribution of social costs across the population of interest. So one of the challenges that we'll talk about in the first and second lecture is that I want to ask this question of, do we target this socially costly consumption? But actually, we don't have very good measures of that at the individual level. So one of the challenges I'm going to need to do first is to try and figure out some way of thinking about what can I observe that's going to be correlated with variation in the social costs of consumption. And I'll talk about that in the case of alcoholic drinks and sugar drinks, where I think we have some information that is not perfect. And so then I want to try and look at how does a tax lead to changes in consumption by those different groups. And so the way I estimate demand is going to be important to allow me to do that. So I first need to understand how the distribution of social costs vary across the population. To do that, then I need a demand model that lets me look at how people are going to respond to the price change from the tax and how that varies across the people. So it's going to have suitable amount of heterogeneity in it. And then I'm going to need to think about how do firms respond to the tax. And then maybe ask, could we design a better targeted policy? So the two papers I'm going to draw on from this is that first one, Tax Design in the Alcohol Market, and then the one, How Well Targeted Are Soda Taxes. But I'll mention a little bit about some of the other papers. So the public economics, and so in all of this literature, I guess what you might think of what these papers are doing is sort of bringing together standard public economics with modern methods in I/O. And so the kind of contribution of most of this literature is to bring those two things together to try and improve our understanding of the answer to these questions. So kind of standard public economics 101, if we want a corrective tax, Piju in the 1920s showed that if the marginal externality is constant, so if the, okay, if the social cost that is generated by each marginal bit of consumption is the same across all people, so if drinking 1 unit more of alcohol has the same social cost across everyone, then we can implement a tax that increases the price by that amount, and that will be the first best. We'll perfectly correct for that. So, however, we know that marginal externalities often vary. So I'm going to think about the case of alcohol. Many people just have a simple glass of wine now and then, and the social costs are nothing. Other people drink way in excess, get violent, beat their kids, impose large social costs on people and on themselves in future. So Diamond considered the case where there's heterogeneous marginal externalities, so different people incur different social costs, but goods are all the same. So you just think of alcohol, you just buy units of alcohol, and the social costs are different across people. Then he showed that you can implement a tax that's kind of equal to the weighted average of people's marginal externality. It won't be first best, it'll be second best though, and that's sort of as good as you can do. So we're interested in the case that we think is more realistic when people vary in the social cost and goods are differentiated. So in almost all the markets we're talking about, that we tend to think about, where governments intervene in regulation or taxes, a small number of firms that have market power produce differentiated products, and those products may have different amounts of the externality generating thing in it. So in alcohol, you have beer, wine, spirits, you have strong beer, weak beer, you have all different types of alcoholic goods. And they may, people that have different degrees of marginal externality may have differential preferences over those. And so that the intersection of those may mean that we need to, first of all, if we want to evaluate the effects of a tax, we need to think about that, because the tax is going to change the relative price of those different goods differentially. It's not just that people are buying some uniform alcohol, just go buy ethanol. And so just even to evaluate the effect of a tax, we want to take that into account. People may respond differently to those prices, but it also may give us the opportunity to design a better tax if we can use that to sort of target people. So if we can design the tax such that it leads to greater price increases for people who have higher marginal externalities. And so that's what the first kind of two papers do, is implement that. So if you look at existing alcohol taxes pretty much anywhere in the world, they're very poorly targeted. They do exactly the opposite of what I just described. They tax products that are more preferred by people who generate bigger social costs less than products that people who don't generate so much social costs buy. So they do kind of exactly the wrong thing, and I'll show you that in a picture in a bit. So in alcohol, there's many differentiated products, and consumers vary in their social costs they generate, and they have different tastes for those and different preference parameters in general. They'll be more or less responsive to price and other characteristics of those goods. So the one way of saying that more formally is that consumers' individual demand curves for individual products may be correlated with their marginal externality from ethical consumption. And so that means that higher taxes on alcohol products that are disproportionately preferred by the high marginal externality people may be able to really target better the socially costly consumption and to be more effective at reducing socially costly consumption. Whereas the tax systems that we have now do exactly the opposite of that. But empirically, so we can show that idea theoretically pretty straightforwardly, but empirically, what we need to know whether that has any bite is we need to know something about the shape of demand. That's not something that we know theoretically. And so the price responsiveness of understanding how price responsiveness varies across different types of consumers, in particular with the scale of their social costs, so how that correlates with their marginal externality, is going to be what's key to understanding if this idea has any empirical importance and so any relevance for policy. And so the kind of role that an econometrician can play is to help estimate demand, to learn about that object. But then in doing that, it's really important that we specify a demand model and the shape of demand that allows us to capture that relationship. And standard approaches to estimating demand wouldn't allow us to do that, right? And so that's what's key here is that we learn about that, the shape of demand in that flexible way. Yeah.
Just a very quick question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering why, is there any rationale why many countries are taxing poor? As you said,
yeah.
But there must be a rationale.
Well, so I guess so there's probably two answers to that. So if you wanted to impute rationality to what governments were currently doing, you could argue that they were behaving more like in a Pigovian world, where they didn't think about differentiated products. So, you know, before most alcohol taxes were implemented quite a long time ago, probably before Pigou even wrote. So they were implemented in a world where people didn't think about that. So they maybe would just introduce one kind of uniform tax. The other is that governments mostly introduced alcohol taxes to raise revenue. So alcohol taxes in the UK were introduced centuries ago, not as corrective taxes, but as revenue raising. But these kind of concerns, you know, it's only really very recently, since the 80s or something, that we've really thought about differentiated product markets in these kind of ways. And so, in fact, this argument persuaded the Chancellor of the UK to reform alcohol taxes. It's like the one thing good that came out of Brexit is we're reforming our alcohol taxes. It's like the only thing good that came out of Brexit. But so I think it's not that governments have ignored this. I think they just hadn't really thought about it before now. And so it's not, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to first talk about application to alcohol taxes, and then I'll talk a little quickly about soda taxes in a slightly different way. So how important is this idea in practice in UK alcohol markets? In order to answer that question, we need to know something about the shape of demand and how it differs across people, particularly correlated with their marginal externality. So just a little aside, I'm going to go through this super quickly about how we model demand in IO when we have differentiated product markets. So for some of you, this may be like completely familiar if you've ever heard anything about discrete choice demand and Barry Levinson Pakey's and any kind of modern IO. If not, you won't understand it, but hopefully I'll get you interested enough to go and read the papers that do this. So this has probably been one of the bigger innovations in the way we model the behavior of consumers and firms in markets where there's differentiated products. So markets where there's differentiated products are basically all markets that competition authorities are interested in, and for mostly that public health people are interested in. It's markets where there's a small number of firms that often sell many brands, and those brands are horizontally differentiated from each other. Okay. So I'm just going to go through 2 slides about why it's important that we think about modeling demand in this way in these types of markets. So, and I've given you the references to readings that go through this in much more detail. So in particular, that NIVO 2000 paper is like a PhD student's guide to discrete choice demand modeling. It's an excellent paper. So standard early models of demand, like based on Deaton, etc., thought about vectors of quantities. So you'd have so it'd be a model of demand for alcohol as a quantity of alcohol, liters of alcohol purchased or something, as a function of prices, some exogenous demand shifters, where each product was an individual. So you'd have, that demand model would there'd be each element of the vector would be an individual product. So if you think about differentiated product markets, so think about things in the supermarket, alcohol products, there's 6,000 varieties of alcohol, right? So it's not feasible to estimate a demand model like that with that many products. So what people tend to do, because the dimensionality just gets too big and there's a huge amount of sparsity, so there's, most people won't buy most products. Normally people just buy one or two products. You have a ton of zeros, which is very difficult to deal with, and the size of the problem will just be enormous. So, and it's also not very easy to deal with heterogeneity and preferences, which I've just motivated as being like the big thing we're interested in here. So the solution that people came up to deal with that problem is to move to characteristic space. So rather than having a demand model like Deaton, etc., where people prefer, this good or that good, you have a demand model where people like characteristics. So I like the chocolate characteristic, or I like the creamy characteristic, or I like the crunchy characteristic. And so each good then can be defined by a set of characteristics, and in any market you have a smaller number of characteristics that a product will have different amounts of. And that makes it much more tractable to then estimate demand across a whole bunch of differentiated products, okay? So, and what it particularly allows us to do is to reflect the fact that some products are going to be better substitutes for each other because they're more similar in the characteristic space. It also allows us, which I'll show in a minute, to incorporate more rich heterogeneity, and heterogeneity in a way that says, I really like chocolate and I'm not so bothered about crunchiness. And so then my preferences are going to be correlated across all of the chocolatey goods, but not so much with the crunchy goods. And so that means that's going to do a much better job of reflecting my substitution patterns if the price of one good changes and I go to another. So these types of characteristics models have a lot of power in these types of markets. And they let us deal with a bunch of things to do with heterogeneity in a much nicer way that I'll talk about. So they're usually implemented in a discrete choice framework. So that what I'll talk about here is entirely in a discrete choice framework, meaning we think about demand in each moment of time is like a shopping occasion. I go in and I choose the variety that is my most preferred variety, the one that gives me the biggest utility. You can adapt these models to deal with people who choose more than one good, but we're not going to worry about that here. It's not something we focused on. We'll have a quantity component to what we look at, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So in a model in a differentiated product market, a consumer will have some utility from a good that's going to be a function, importantly, of these characteristics. So this is going to be some vector of characteristics, chocolatiness, crunchiness, etc. Price will be a characteristic, and then there's going to be a bunch of preferences. And what's going to be important is the way that so what I'll talk a lot about in each of the lectures is how we specify these functions of characteristics in ways that allow us to really answer the question I set out in the beginning, right? How good are these policies at reducing socially costly consumption? And so it's going to be the function of the way that these things enter and the way the preference parameters will enter are going to be really important for the kind of restrictions that we impose on the shape of demand and the way in which these estimates allow us to answer the questions we're interested in. And so that's really going to be the theme of all of the lectures in a way, is how do we have the balance between allowing this shape be empirically tractable, such that we can estimate it with the kind of data we have and the kind of methods that we have, but also informative about the questions we want to ask. That sounds like really obvious, but I can't tell you the number of papers I see that people say, I want to ask this question, and then specify a demand model that would never allow you to answer that question, or assumes the answer to the question, right? And so you really need to be careful that you marry those two up. And so one of the reasons that this the discrete choice demand literature is so important and influential is that it really focuses on the important, it allows us to investigate a lot and focus on the importance of consumer heterogeneity. And so I'm not going to go through the detail of this, but just to point out that if this is something that you don't know about and you're interested in, it's really good to go read Aviv's work, because like a simple discrete choice demand model without heterogeneity imposes very restrictive substitution patterns and demand patterns on, it basically doesn't allow for much heterogeneity in the way people would respond to a change in price in terms of the substitution patterns, and it imposes that those substitution patterns are like the same across all goods in some classes, etc. So that's what that says, is just that if you just do a standard discrete choice demand model, like a logit model or something, without consumer heterogeneity, you're really imposing a ton of restrictions on the shape of demand, and any evaluation you do or any analysis you do is not going to be very interesting, because you've basically baked into the demand estimates substitution patterns that are very restricted. So what this messy slide looks like is that and Berry, Levinson, and Paikes, which was a kind of very seminal paper, shows that by allowing for preference heterogeneity, particularly we do that through random coefficients on the preference parameters. So all that means is that we're going to allow for a lot of unobserved preference heterogeneity that we're going to let the data tell us about. We're going to say everyone doesn't respond the same to price. I don't know whether you respond a lot to price and you don't respond so much, but I'm going to assume that amongst all of us, the distribution of responsiveness is a normal distribution, and I'm going to estimate from the data the mean and the standard deviation of that distribution. And so that'll tell me something about the amount of heterogeneity, and if I want, I could make it not normal, I could make it some other distribution, I just need to say what the distribution is. But if I want, I can also allow other things to vary in that. So I can say, I'm going to allow men to have a different distribution to women. I'm going to allow rich people to have a different distribution to poor people. I'm going to allow very heavy drinkers to have a different distribution to light drinkers, which might be correlated with their social costs, right? And so the way that heterogeneity enters is going to be what's going to be key to helping us answer the question that we want to ask about the reduction of social costs. Yeah.
So could you tell us what capital P subscript A and capital P subscript B are?
Sorry, I didn't hear what the subscript you were asking is.
Integrating over the infinite D, PB and the DB. What are
Yeah.
PB and PB?
These are the, so it's not that, so here I haven't actually written this out properly for you. I've copied this from Nevo. So this is integrating over the distribution of preferences. Yeah, yeah. So the point of putting this up was just to show you that this is a much more complicated and flexible object than this is. I haven't actually written out the full model here, so you can't see that. But yeah, that's all. Yeah. Okay. So so that was just a little aside on where the IO literature went in the sort of 80s and 90s, and why it's interesting. I said one of the contributions of what these papers have done is that they've brought the intuition from the IO literature into the more public economics literature. And so, okay, so back to the question that we're interested in, which is what's the effect of alcohol taxes? So why a discrete choice framework? So most work from the public economics literature that had tried to evaluate the impact of alcohol taxes had estimated demand for alcohol as an aggregate good. saying, well, what we care about is ethanol consumption. So ethanol is the thing that makes you drunk. Ethanol is the thing that we think leads to people behaving badly, committing crimes, having liver disease, whatever. So we can just estimate a demand model for ethanol, basically. But the reason that isn't sufficient is because this is a market in which you have a bunch of differentiated goods, which have some characteristics, like gin that has botanicals in it, beer that's hoppy and comes from some microbrewery, etc. And people may have preferences over those characteristics as well as the ethanol. Different products have different levels of ethanol in them. And so the way a tax affects the price of that good is going to differ according to the type of good. So it's going to change. A tax isn't just going to lift the price of all the goods by the same amount. It's going to change the relative prices, because it's going to change, because these goods have different amounts of ethanol, and the tax is going to change that differentially. So it's going to change the relative price of different goods, and consumers have different preferences for the other characteristics. So an aggregate demand model doesn't allow you to capture all of that substitution, and particularly doesn't allow you to investigate the question about whether people, or whether the impact of this issue of is the social cost that they're generating correlated with the shape of their demand curve that I talked about in the beginning. So discrete choice demand allows you to do that. It allows you to capture switching between disaggregate alcohol products. So we implement a tax system, it changes relative prices. Do consumers switch between different types of alcohol? Do they switch out of the alcohol market altogether? If we just estimate a single aggregate demand model, all you're capturing is like the aggregate effect of switching out, but not the switching between products, right? And so that's, and it avoids, as I talked about before, it avoids this curse of dimensionality if we wanted to take like a standard demand model and estimate it at a product level. For some reason that stopped working. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about one example paper with Martin O'Connell and Kate Smith that looks at evaluating the UK alcohol taxes and looks at whether we could use this idea of this correlation in demand and externalities to develop a better tax. So as I said, I'm going to go through each of these sort of rather quickly rather than going through the details, because I want to highlight a few aspects, but you can find a lot of the details in the papers. So we're going to think about the UK alcohol market. We're going to model that as on each choice occasion. So a choice occasion is going to be like a weekly shop or something. Consumers think about selecting one of 69 alcohol products or not buying alcohol at all. So in reality, I said there's like 6,000 alcohol products in the market. I'll talk more about the data in a minute, but in all three lectures, the kind of data I'm going to be using is very detailed scanner data, where we know everything people buy at the barcode level. So you have very disaggregate, and so that means you data on, and you observe the same individual buying a lot of stuff over time. That's going to turn out to be very useful for identifying heterogeneity, and you observe the really detailed product characteristics.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So in your setup, I'm just trying to get the causal,
Yeah.
the temporal thing right. So you're saying the person chooses 69 alcohol options or an outside option. Or you can model it that he or she chooses to drink alcohol and then chooses to choose within the 69 products, because
That's a more restricted version of what we do. Okay. So what we've done, we have all those those options simultaneously, and we allow correlation between them. So you're talking about a nesting structure? Yeah. So that would be a restricted version of what we're doing. Yeah. There may be, in some applications, that may be a very sensible way of doing it. You may want to impose that structure, or you may be interested. Policy may affect different aspects of that differently, for example. So that's a completely valid modeling choice to make in certain contexts. Here we've just done it all in one go. The other thing that's maybe a little different is that in these alcohol products are going to be different sizes of the same type of good. So you can buy a small bottle of gin or a big bottle of gin, or you can buy small beer or big beer. So that's going to turn out to be quite important in several of the applications, particularly in lecture 2, where that quantity choice is often not embedded in discrete choice framework, and people often criticize discrete choice framework for saying, well, you're not capturing the quantity dimension. But that's not true. There's two ways that quantity is captured in the discrete choice framework. One is if you go to a disaggregate enough amount of time, then the frequency with which people purchase is a quantity decision, basically. Do I go and buy a can of Coke every day, or do I only buy every other day? That's a quantity decision there. And but you can also just embed it as I can buy a small can of Coke or a big can of Coke, and you can have that as part of your discrete choice decision. And so and in this instance here, we're going to be embedding that quantity decision here, and sometimes you see that what a tax does, or the advertising ban is going to do, is really shift people between those quantities quite much more than it's going to shift them in or out of the market. Okay, so I motivated all this by saying what I really want to know is about whether people that have high externalities and high social costs respond. But I don't observe people's social costs, so what am I going to do about that? Well, we're going to we have longitudinal data. We follow people repeatedly for over long periods of time. And I'm going to look at households' behavior in the past. And I'm going to argue that the total amount of alcohol that you drink habitually over a long period of time, like over a year, is correlated, or is like monotonic in the amount of externality that you generate. So people who just drink a little bit once in a while don't generate very much social cost. People who drink a lot regularly generate more social costs. The problem is I'm not going to know how much that differs. I'm not going to know the shape of that function, right? So I'm not going to how convex that function is. So how much more? If I drink twice as much as you, how much higher are my externalities? So what we're going to do is just specify an unknown function and then look at how our results differ for different assumptions about how convex social costs are. So how much more a heavy drinker accounts for social costs than a light drinker. So in the paper, we use a bunch of data information about that convexity, like the probability of getting liver disease depending on how much you drink, to argue that that shape is quite convex. But here I'm just going to show you some results for different degrees of convexity. And so that's often that's unknown, that shape of that social cost function is an unknown. And so one way we can deal with things like that are unknowns to provide policymakers with good information is to be clear it's an unknown, not just to assume a value, and then to say, okay, well, I'm going to assume all the reasonable values one could think it would take, and I'm going to show you my results throughout that full range so that you can see the degree of uncertainty. If this policy is going to be welfare and improving in any of those circumstances, then we can be very confident that it is. If it's, welfare improving only above a certain threshold, then we really need to know that we need to get evidence about that threshold. So that's an approach that's really commonly taken in competition policy, where when competition authorities are deciding about mergers or something, they'll think about threshold values, and then we don't really care what the point estimate of the elasticity is. We just need to know, is it bigger than 5 or less than 5? And then that's something that we might be much more comfortable taking a stance on than really having to have a point estimate. So Chuck Mansky has some really interesting work on exactly how you do good empirical work for policy in the face of uncertainty and not knowing things like that. And this is an example of a way we can kind of tackle that problem. So these show density functions of the cumulative share of people from the highest, so it's like a Lorenz curve. So this is the share of people from the person who drinks the least to the person who drinks the most, and this is the share of alcohol that they drink. So and one's for the UK and one's for the US. So what this shows is that there's a small number of people that drink a lot, and there's a lot of people that drink a little. right? And that's very convex. And so in the paper, we show a bunch of other evidence that like these guys, not only do they drink a lot, they binge drink more, they engage in all sorts of behaviors that are more risky and more likely to be associated with high social costs. And so that motivates us to think about the idea that these social costs are very convex. And so then we will evaluate all of our results for different levels of the convexity here. So like arguing that, you know, the social costs incurred by this 5% are like, you know, twice as big or 3 times as big or 4 times as these people here. So that's what I mean by more convexity. They account for a greater share of the total social costs. So that basically says what I just said. So evidence suggests that externalities are convex in alcohol consumption. So the more, you know, you get some like threshold effects with diseases at very low levels of alcohol consumption. Your liver repairs itself very easily, but once you get into high levels, it becomes compounded, and so that there's some convexity to that. So it could also be that some people generate more externality. We don't reflect that in what we do. In fact, our reading of the evidence is that conditional on the amount you drink, there's not a lot of variation across people. So a lot of people say, oh, well, men are responsible for much more alcohol-induced violence than women. But that's only true conditional on what they drink. So men drink more too. And so there's really not that much evidence that conditional on how much you drink, different types of people generate more social costs than others. Though if one had, that would be very easy to integrate into this approach. We just didn't have evidence that that was the case. Okay, so what I want to really be careful about then is that the demand model that I estimate, that I specify and estimate, allows me to capture that variation across that the distribution of drinking. So what we do, this is a fancy way of basically writing what we do, this term is what's interesting, is that we discretize this distribution. This distribution here, we discretize this into like heavy drinkers would be this top 10%, you know, medium heavy, medium, light heavy, light drinkers. So we discretize that distribution based on past information. So we're estimating demand this year, and we use last few years to understand your habitual drinking. And then we allow all the preference parameters to vary with that distribution. So we allow people who drink a lot to have different preference parameters over individual types of alcohol, which is this Z bit here, and then we're going to allow individuals to have different preferences over prices and over the size. Sorry, I haven't put over the size of the pack. And so what's the way that we specify these parameters, as I said, so the heterogeneity that we're going to allow is going to be both observed. I'm going to allow the heterogeneity to vary with your past drinking distribution, and I could also allow income or social background or whatever in there. But I'm also going to allow unobserved heterogeneity. So for example, the parameter on prices has an I subscript, I being individual. And I'm going to allow that to vary, I'm going to assume it's normally distributed, but potentially correlated with some kind of tastes. And I'm going to estimate the distribution of that from the data. So I'm going to be able to say, identified from the data, that some people are very sensitive to prices, some people are not that sensitive to prices, and that varies with some characteristics to do with their taste for alcohol strength and ethanol. So people who are heavy drinkers could be really price sensitive, maybe if they're lower income. People who are light drinkers could be less price sensitive, or the other way around. I'll let the data tell me which of those is true, right? Yeah.
How is J different from S oil?
How is
J different from S oil?
J is different from
S.
J is the brand, and S is the pack size. So there's going to be a quantity decision. So I've changed the order of these. I'm going to define those in a second. Sorry. For do as I say, not as I do. This is a terrible slide because I've put a lot of subscripts and not told you what they are. So sorry. So we're estimating demand for brands. So brands here are going to be like cheap generic gin, fancy branded gin, and then size is going to be a small size and a big size. So in all three of the lectures, I'm going to have that feature and demand models of that margin to move across size as price changes is actually going to be quite an important one in some dimensions.
One other question. Why do you have both I and M on the gamma? That's like you would have preference per user and their cost, median cost, or just their median? So I would not put I.
Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Sorry, why do you have both I and M as subscripts of gamma?
Here?
Yeah. Do you want gamma to be a per household parameter?
Yeah. So what that means. So that's a really good question. So I is I allows for this to be normally distributed across individuals. So when you specify the random a random coefficients model, you say like it's going to be normally distributed, and I'm going to estimate the mean and the standard deviation. And the M is saying I'm going to allow that distribution to vary across high people who consume a lot and people who don't. So it's called a mixing distribution. So I'm going to allow there are going to be 4 different random coefficient distributions which shift both in the mean and the standard deviation for different people with different drinking. So that's an important level of heterogeneity that's going to really allow us to capture that. The other important bit is that I'm going to allow for some correlation of that with prices, so that people who are heavy drinkers could have a different price sensitivity, a different precedent for ethanol, and a different correlation between those. And that whole distribution can differ across those groups.
You're about notation. W is quantity and Z is
Ethanol.
ethanol.
Yeah. I think W is actually just other characteristics, in fact, here. Okay, so, sorry, I put these out of order. So the data we're going to use is household and individual level scanner data. So again, in all 3 lectures, I'm going to use this kind of data, and I'll talk about some of the different characteristics in each case. So what's really good about this data? So this is data that market research firms called Kantars in Malaysia, I think it's AC Nielsen that collects these data. In the US, it's AC Nielsen. They get households to record everything they buy and bring into the home. In lecture 2, I'll actually use data where they also record what they buy out. So what's nice about this is you observe for the same household or individual, you observe repeated, like a lot of repeated purchases in different settings. So where prices may differ, where characteristics may differ in different markets. And so you observe the exact prices, the quantities, and the characteristics of the individual products. So that differs from like standard consumer data that you get from at the government survey level, which tends to be much more aggregated, or then scanner data that you get from individual shops, where you just observe what's purchased in that shop, but you don't observe everything that that person buys, right? So it has some really nice features to it. In one of which I've already emphasized is that longitudinal data allows us to look at what people did in the past, and so it likes to condition on that. But it also really facilitates our ability to identify this individual preferences because we're observing the same people. So if we are willing to assume that people's preferences don't change over time, which is a question we want to do that, but under that assumption, we're observing the same person in different choice situations, facing different price vectors, different characteristics, making choices that really allows us a lot of power to identify those preference parameters.
Does this data include, say, alcohol consumption in a pub, in a restaurant?
So this data right now doesn't. There's other data we have that does. So most, like over 2/3 of alcohol consumption's in the home. That's not expenditure. Expenditure is more out because pub drinks are more. But the bulk of alcohol consumption in the UK is actually in the home, and that's more true for people who drink a lot. So for people who drink a lot, it's more like over 80%. And the other thing is that prices in the supermarket are much cheaper than in the pub, like orders of magnitude cheaper. And so you might think that the process, the preferences and decision making over that is different to in the pub. And in fact, the Competition Commission did an investigation, of which I was the chief economist, so maybe that's not an independent piece of information, but into a merger in the brewing industry, and concluded that the at-home market was a separate market to the pub market, so that people didn't tend to substitute from one to the other, in part because the prices are so much different, but also because the characteristics are very different.
It answers my question, because the reason why I asked is because for heavy drinkers who drink in the pub, because the price will hit them, not at the same time, but because you consume one and you decide whether or not you want to consume the other. And I'm just thinking that alcohol might impair your decision making.
Yeah, so estimating a model in which you assume rational choice in alcohol consumption is always a problem, but less so when you're buying it in the supermarket prior to consumption, not in the pubs. So don't get me wrong, if we had all the data in the pubs, I would completely use it here, so it's not that I don't want to use it, but I don't think it's meaningless to think about this margin here. Yep, so it's scanner data from the Kantar World Panel, it's called. So we have over 11,500 households that we observe buying over many time periods. So as I said, there's over 7,000 alcohol products and 3,000 brands. So we're aggregating those so I gave you this whole story about how I don't want to aggregate because it causes all these problems. So we're aggregating quite a lot for tractability. We aggregate in a way that we think over products that are going to have similar characteristics with respect to the tax system, so that the effect of the tax on their prices is going to be similar. But one could argue about whether, so that's a decision that we've made, balancing tractability with flexibility, which we think is reasonable, but intelligent people could differ on that. Okay, so before I show you some estimates of the demand model, we're interested in answering this question: is the policy achieving what the social planner wants to achieve? Is it leading to reduction in social costly consumption? So let's just say quickly what we think the social planner is trying to achieve. So the social planner wants to choose a vector of taxes that maximizes the sum of consumer surplus plus tax revenue minus this externalities, the social costs. Okay, and so I write that down because I want to think about what one of the things that we're interested in thinking about is, so we're going to show that the current tax system is very poorly targeted. It doesn't lead to reductions in consumption by the most socially costly. We're not going to derive an optimal tax, but we're going to think about, can we derive a better tax that's a kind of feasible tax in line with the kind of tax system we currently have, and how much better does it do? So it's costly to change taxes. Is it going to improve welfare by a lot or by a little? So we want to write this down to think about the welfare consequences of any tax change. So we do know, however, that the optimal tax would be a consumer-specific tax. So we can compare the current tax system to a tax where we just had an individual tax level for every individual that was their marginal social cost, right? That's not a feasible tax to implement, though actually in some areas like taxation of savings now, we are moving to individual specific taxes. So it's not that that's completely impossible to imagine in the future, but that would be like the first best that we could get. And so we're going to compare the types of taxes that we look at to that style of tax. So we're going to compare the current tax system we have to a single ethanol tax. So how much better would just be the simplest kind of diamond, simple single ethanol tax to the current system? Turns out it'll be better even. And then, is there any merit to this idea that I mentioned before, that if demand is correlated, if the shape of consumers' demand is correlated in such a way that the people who have the highest social costs also have different preferences over different type of characteristics. Can the tax system utilize that to get somewhere close to that individual taxing, changing individual prices by targeting those types of goods more than others? And it turns out they will be able to. So that's an idea that's been raised in other aspects of the tax system. Akerlof had some work that's called like tagging. Can we implement in environmental taxes? People talk about that. Can you, identify some parts of demand that you want to, that you know that type of consumption is associated with a certain type of social cost, and can you use that correlation to increase the price of those types of goods more?
Rachel,
Yeah.
is it standard in this literature to add the tax revenue to social planners' problems? So we can.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is that obvious that taxes are transferred? Why do we want to maximize one for one to welfare the tax intake?
So it's a good question. So we report it separately, so you can take it out if you want. I think the idea is usually it's the social planner. So that's not a good answer.
I understand that's what governments want. Maybe that's what you're going.
Yeah. No. I understand your question.
It's not obvious. This is a transfer. Maybe it's a choice, just like as a consumer welfare standard, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to be standard. So you think of the government taking it and then redistributing it lump sum. So I think so. What we're going to talk about is it's actually not in the soda tax version. If you think about the welfare implications, you can make different assumptions about what the government does with that revenue. So does it use it to redistribute? So I think that's where it's. Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not obvious, right?
That you want, yeah.
Taxes are a way to maximize whatever it is.
No, but otherwise you're just having it as a loss. So you do want to include it, because if you don't include it, then consumers are going to lose. And so there's two things here. So one is firms are paying taxes, and so we may or may not want to put those into the utility function. But two, consumers are paying taxes, and that money is not disappearing. It's a transfer back to them. So including it is like saying consumers value the tax revenue because it's a transfer back to them. Right? And so if you don't include it, then you're not accounting for that amount that they're getting transferred back. Right? So I think it's kind of on the assumption that it's going back into consumers' utility in some way. And then you can make different assumptions about the way it's going back. Okay, so all else equal, we can use this expression for what the product level taxes look like to think about the fact that we could derive some conditions under which we know these taxes will be better. By how much will depend on the shape of demand exactly, but if these product level taxes are going to be higher for goods that are highly demanded by high marginal externality consumers, and they're going to be higher the stronger is the correlation between that externality and the own price elasticities, and they're going to be the lower the stronger is the correlation of the marginal externalities and the cross slope of demand, meaning how willing are consumers to switch away to other substitute products in demand space. So you're going to want to tax highly goods that high externality, high social cost consumers really like. You're going to want to do that more if they're more price sensitive, because they're going to switch away more. But you're going to want to do it less if what they switch away to is another alcohol product, not to outside the market, right? And so when you see that, what becomes clear is that it's really important that we have a demand model that allows for all of those things. So if we weren't allowing, for example, for people to switch outside of the market, we'd be shutting off some piece of that. If we weren't allowing for correlation between the marginal externality and the slope of elasticity, so if we weren't allowing for that heterogeneity that varied with M, that IM point, then we wouldn't be capturing that second point. So if we want to answer this question well, it's really important that we have a demand model that has these features to it, which is what we wrote down before. Okay, so what about the externality function then? I've told you we don't know anything, we don't know about that. So what we're going to do is specify a function that allows us to pick up some of that convexity I showed you. And then we're just going to vary the degree of convexity, this θ1, this phi1 parameter, which is going to vary how concentrated the costs are. And we're going to look at how well the welfare consequences of the tax systems for different values of that convexity. So we're going to express that as the share that high drinkers account for of total social costs. So it's like how that Lorenz curve I showed you before, how convex is that? Okay, so this is the current UK tax system. So from everything I've said, this is what you'd want is a tax system that at least had straight lines here, such that higher strength alcohol products, which are more preferred by people who drink more, are taxed more. What this tax system does is tax most highly low strength alcohol products and tax least high strength alcohol products. We'll show you the optimal single tax is actually going to be increasing. You want to tax, because people who drink a lot prefer stronger drinks, you're going to want to tax these higher than these, but you certainly don't want a reducing. This is not a peculiarity of the UK system. All European countries and the US have similar systems. I don't know about here, but this is a common form of taxation. Okay, so we estimate the demand model, we get some elasticities from that, and then we can use that to look at what the optimal single rate was. So what I wrote down before, the Pigouvian rate here, diamond, the single rate that's going to reflect the heterogeneity, but just give you a single rate, and then we can get the optimal product level rates. These aren't going to be optimal taxes in a general sense, they're just going to be optimal conditional on that structure of a tax system and this demand model. Okay, so as I just said, so along the horizontal axis, we have the percent of the external costs that are generated by heavy drinkers. So at 60 is this is the equivalent of, so heavy drinkers account for 60% of consumption. So if they accounted for 60% of the externalities, that would be like everyone had the same social cost. So that's like the Pigou or diamond world, social costs are constant across everyone. The more we move in this direction, the more convex social costs are. So this says that the 60%, the people, the heavy drinkers who account for 60% of consumption generate 90% of the costs, right? So this is, we don't know where we lie on this, but probably we're up here somewhere. So the optimal single tax rate, if you're just going to have one tax rate, is increasing. The more convex these costs are, the higher you want the tax rate to be. That's because in the tax system, we find that there's that correlation is high, that people who, the heavy drinkers drink the types of products that have high alcohol. So taxing the higher alcohol products higher is going to lead to them substituting away, facing higher prices. In addition, they have a price sensitivity that leads to them substituting away. And while they substitute some away to other alcohol products, they also substitute some out of the market. So those conditions I just showed you a minute ago. So the optimal single tax rate is going to be increasing and look very different to the current one. But we could do much better with a rate that varied across different types of alcohol. The differences are driven by the different preferences that we estimate for heavy drinkers. So the heavy drinkers really like drinking spirits, of strong spirits and wine, and they don't like so much drinking and cheap wine, apparently, like wine. And so that drives those rates to be higher, where products that they don't prefer to be lower. So that result is driven very much by the specifics of the demand model, and so one might want to think carefully about that before really implementing it, but the overall tax rate one is probably pretty robust to the specifics of the tax model. So I'm going to show you one more result on alcohol because I want to talk quickly about soda taxes as well. So ignore this red line. What this shows you is compares the single rate that's like Pigou. So this asks the question, how much better do we do by moving to this. So this shows you welfare relative to the UK tax system. So first of all, it shows you how much better do we do than the existing tax system if we move to one of these, either the single rate or the multi-rate across different types of tax, and how does that difference vary depending on the convexity of the external costs. So if you start here, we're in a world where Pigou and where Diamond in particular is right, that we have heterogeneous goods, but the social cost is the same across everyone. And so we don't do any better than the single rate system does better than the UK rate, but it does it by a little bit. But the multi-rate system is actually worse. It doesn't improve anything. In fact, it gets it a little worse because we don't have any variation in social costs. The more we have this convexity of social costs, where we have really a lot of heterogeneity in social costs, a small number of people really account for almost all of the social costs, the bigger the gain is from targeting that group of people, from designing a tax system that sets the tax higher on the products that the people that generate the most social costs generate. And those are pretty big numbers. You know, we gain a lot in welfare terms. Right? Yeah.
How is it possible that the multi-rate is worse than single rate? Just multi-rate being good single rate.
Couldn't you just mimic the single rate by the multi-rate? I was wondering that when I said that too. I don't remember. That's a good question, and I don't remember exactly. We must be imposing something that doesn't allow that, because you'd think that they would intersect there. I think so too, so I'm not sure what's driving that.
What's the red one again?
It's a different paper that I didn't talk about. It's a price floor, which is a different policy altogether. Okay, so I want to move on to talk about soda taxes because it's a slightly different point. So when we consider corrective taxes that are aimed at correcting some kind of consumption externality, it's important, one, that we think about what the object of government policy is. The object of government policy is not to reduce alcohol consumption, it's to reduce socially costly alcohol consumption. So evaluating the effect of the policy on aggregate alcohol consumption doesn't tell us very much. In addition, these are markets in which there's a lot of differentiated products. So when we think about evaluating the impact of the policies, we need to be careful to model the effect of the tax rise on the prices of those differential products, because a lot of what the policy is going to do, I didn't show you this, but it's true, is lead to people substituting within the alcohol market. You know, you change the relative prices, a lot of what happens is people substitute goods, some substitution goes outside the market, but you get a lot of change in total consumption from substitution within. Yeah, and I said the rest of it. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about just in the last 15 minutes is another approach to looking at the same question, soda taxes. What does government want to do when it implements soda taxes? The aim is not just to reduce soda consumption, it's to reduce soda consumption that's socially costly, because soda consumption is going to be more socially costly for some people than for other people. So this is a case, though, where we don't have quite the same, so we do have a little bit a similar setup as we do in the alcohol market, but it's not so obvious what the social costs increase with. So there's been much less work done on the social cost of excess soda consumption. Is it cumulative in sugar, like in alcohol? Are there sort of some convexities in sugar? Some people argue that maybe there are, but we don't have great evidence on that. Is it more damaging for children? Is it more damaging for people in other settings? All of those are possibilities, but we have much less good evidence. So what we're going to do in this paper is exploit the long time series of the panel to not estimate, so the heterogeneity I just estimated in that last model was one where I said, consumers have different responsiveness to price and other characteristics. I want to account for that, and I want to allow some unobservable heterogeneity there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume like a normal distribution, and I'm going to estimate just the mean and the variance of that. So I only have to estimate 2 parameters, and that's going to completely define the degree of preference heterogeneity over prices, for example. Or maybe I'll allow that, as I explained, I'll allow some mixing distribution, so I'll allow there to be a couple different distributions, but it's still going to be a very small number of parameters. But I've had to make a lot of parametric assumptions to do that. I have to assume some kind of distribution, normal, usually normal or log normal, and maybe that's not a good assumption. And so there's a lot of work that's gone on, mostly theoretical, about non-parametric identification in those settings. And so this is a paper where we try and implement that idea and non-parametrically identify the distribution of preferences. And we do that by exploiting the long panel, where we observe people over several years. And when we observe something like Coke, people tend to buy quite frequently. So we observe them purchasing on a lot of different occasions. And so we basically estimate an individual demand model for every person. We do impose some of the coefficients to be common, but so it's, so we use the long T as well as the big I, the big, per cross-section, the big, we observe a lot of people, but we also observe everyone over a long time series. So that's not really been done very much before. The reason why, partly because it's pretty new to have this long time series data. The motivation for this is that sugar consumption across the world is insanely high. It's like, I always thought this was a bit like, who cares about soda consumption, right? Until you look at sugar consumption. In the UK, children like 2 years old consume more sugar than an adult should consume. Sugar consumption is like crazy excess. And there's a growing body of evidence that that does really bad things to people, particularly to children. That having that much sugar when you're young leads to like poor performance in school, maybe because some kind of physiological aspects of brain development and physical development, etc. That literature is still pretty new, so it's not all really well identified, but there's definitely a growing body of evidence that too much sugar consumption, particularly when young, is really quite bad. Interestingly, it seems to be much worse for low-income kids than high-income kids. Again, that's not so well understood. Maybe parents take compensatory investments or something. But so what we really want to understand is and so soda taxes are being introduced around the world. Many countries now have soda taxes. So are these effective? Do they lead people, so they definitely lead to a reduction in consumption, but do they lead to a reduction in consumption amongst the population which is likely to have the most damage? And here, most of the social costs are probably internalities. The effect on you in the future. So as a kid, you eat too much sugar, you don't do well at school, you have long-term health and social and economic consequences, worse outcomes. There are some externalities, but more internalities. So if what we're doing is raising the price, but not changing behavior, then we're actually making those people worse off, not better off, because they are not saving in terms of the reduced internalities in the future, but they're paying higher prices. So we care about that. So we don't know the externality and internality function here. We would love to. It's an important thing and people should definitely work on that. It's not what we're working on. We don't know the answer to that. Our reading of the literature and for sure government policy suggests though that it's likely higher in young people. It's likely higher, there's possibly some convexity in that a lot of sugar is worse than a little sugar. And that the marginal effect increases, like, for example, the risk of diabetes. And it, as I just mentioned a minute ago, it could be correlated with income in that, at least in a correlative sense, it seems that the consequences of poor consumption for people growing up in deprivation seems to be worse than for people growing up in wealthy households. But the benefit of the approach we're going to take by this non-parametric identification of preference heterogeneity is that these are motivating what we do, but we don't have to specify that from the outcome. So when I estimate a random coefficients model, I need to specify at the beginning how the distribution of those random coefficients is going to vary. So in alcohol, I specified that it varied with total alcohol consumption. Here, I'm not going to have to do that. I'm going to be able to estimate them And then I'm going to have these objects for every individual. I'm going to have their preferences over sugar, their preferences over prices, and I can correlate them with whatever I want. So I can investigate what the distribution looks like and how it's correlated with these and what the joint distribution with these is, etc. So that's one of the real benefits of this kind of more non-parametric approach. So one other motivating fact about sugar taxes is if you look at if you look at all the people in our data and then you look at the sugar intensity of the calories that they consume, so like the government recommends less than 5% or something, so this is everyone's above the recommended level, but the people who are really high get a lot of their sugar from soft drinks. So it's not just that soft drinks have a lot of sugar, it's that for the people who consume way too much sugar, soft drinks are an important source of sugar. And that's particularly true for young people. And that's one of the things that's motivated like governments to introduce soda taxes. Okay, so in this paper in the AER in 2020 with Pierre and Martin, we try and empirically investigate this to look at implement the estimate demand, recover this non-parametric distribution of preference parameters, and then use those to ask how well targeted are soda taxes. So that's the kind of main innovation in the paper. The second main innovation, though, is that it's the data I talked about before, and most scanner data and most data that people estimate demand on is at the household level. When you think about food brought into the home, it mainly only makes sense to think about that at a household level. People don't tend to have their individual food in a household. So when you're estimating demand there, you need to remember that you're usually thinking about like a household utility function, so the aggregation of many individuals' utility functions. So for several reasons, we might be interested in thinking about individual preferences rather than household preferences, particularly if we're thinking about kids, and particularly if we're thinking about something like soda, which is often bought outside of the home and consumed outside of the home. So here we have data that actually measures people's consumption outside of the home. It's like scanner data, but and it's collected on children as well as adults, that age 13 and above, and they record it on their phone. So it's like you have a little app and you just record when you buy stuff, including the price and the characteristics. You know, it's mainly soda, so the characteristics are well recorded already. So this is interesting because on the go, purchase of soft drinks accounts for about half of all soft drinks consumed, whereas most of all of the literature to date had looked at soda consumption within the home because that was the data we had. And so here we're able to learn about people outside the home, and we're able to learn about individual preferences as opposed to household preferences, and we're able to look further down the age distribution than we typically are able to. So then we have this non-parametric specification that exploits the panel. So we also, though, do have the data on the households that these individuals live in. I'm not going to talk about that today, but that can be quite. In this paper, we're also interested in the supply side responses. I won't really dwell on those here, but we implement a tax, as well as being interested how consumers respond. We might be interested on how do firms change their pricing behavior. So do firms pass through the full amount of the tax or not? So clearly, if we want to do that, we need to think about the full demand system that the firm faces, not just demand on the go, because they're going to be setting prices in the market as a whole. And so we also use information on the household level. I won't talk about that part of the paper, but we have that there. Okay, so we have about 5,500 individuals that we observe for several years. We get all the food and drink that they purchase in all the shops, vending machines, and kiosks. So what's an important aspect of that is, so whenever you're estimating these discrete choice demand models, one really important decision is about what the outside good is. So I said in alcohol, it's really important that we included, so you want to know how people substitute between alcohol products and they substitute outside of the market. So there's always an empirical decision to be made about what a choice occasion is. So what does it mean to not buy? So every second of my life, am I thinking about whether to buy a soda or not? then I'd have a ton of zeros for every second of my life that I didn't buy a soda. That's clearly not a reasonable model. But what is the right choice occasion? Economics doesn't really tell us a ton about that, actually. So one of the things that's nice about having a record of all the purchases people made is, so what we consider to be a choice occasion is you went into a shop, and if you didn't buy a drink, that's a 0. But moments of the day which you didn't go into a shop are not zeros. So again, one could debate that decision, but that's always, so in many applications, that choice of the outside good will be very influential on the results you get. And so it's quite important that you think about that carefully. Okay, so blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so we're modeling the behavior in the non-alcoholic drinks market. So soft drinks come in different varieties. So we have like sugary varieties and diet varieties. So the characteristics we're going to think about are brand, pack size, and then the sugariness. So is it sugary or diet? There's not a lot of variation in sugariness. Most soft drinks tend to just be sugary or not sugary. And bottled water is going to be an alternative. Okay, so what all this says, the only thing to take away from this is, so we're going to have the individual's utility is going to be a function of price, sugariness, and whether it's a soft drink, so whether it's carbonated or not, basically. And then this is going to be a whole bunch of unobservable characteristics. So just looking at this first, so the observable characteristics are going to have this I subscript, but now rather than being something that we estimate from the random distribution, I'm just going to estimate each one of those individually. So all 3 of these, there's going to be 1 for each 5,000 of the 5,000 individuals. So we're going to recover 5,000 individual preference parameters for each of these. All these unobservables, and actually this is some of the attributes. I'm not sure what other attributes there are, but things like retailer effects and time effects are not going to be individual specific. We're going to assume that they're common across demographic groups. That's what this DI means. So we're going to place some restriction that like aggregate time effects are common among some groups in some geographic regions. We're not going to allow those to be individually specific. That helps with identification. So I called it non-parametric identification. It's really semi-parametric. I'm allowing the shape of those alpha, beta, and gammas to be fully unspecified, but then I'm imposing some restrictions on the other parameters. So that just says this. But so the other thing that's that this identification strategy lets us do that you can't do with the typical random coefficients thing is accommodate consumers that have infinite preferences in one dimension or another. So if I always buy the sugary variety or I always buy the diet variety in a standard model, that would be hard to accommodate because we don't see any variation in you. And so here we're able to identify that they have, we need to assume that they receive some shocks that would let them sometimes choose that variety. Here we're able to actually give them an infinite preference. So we're saying over several years we've never seen them buy that variety. We're assuming that reflects the fact that they have an infinite taste or distaste for that characteristic. That's a bunch of stuff that I'm going to ignore. So I said that already too. Okay, so I just want to highlight a couple things in this, which is one that we estimate these distributions non-parametrically, and we can show that they're not normal. So that's what these tests are, is tests of skewness and kurtosis, and we can show that we don't recover normal distributions. We can plot those distributions. So if you look at the price coefficient, you can sort of see it's not normal. So we have a bunch of people that have, some people have very strong negative preferences for price, some have moderate, and then some are really pretty indifferent. With soft drinks, we have a bunch of people that have infinite preferences. They only ever buy soft drinks. They never buy non-carbonated drinks. Some have, moderate preferences for them. Some have a distaste for them. And then similarly with the sugar coefficient, we get this, some people only ever buy sugary varieties. Some people have a really strong taste for diet varieties. And then we get these different, some people like the stuff, some people don't. But these are not normal distributions, in part because of the infinite preferences, but even within those we reject normality. I haven't put this up here, but in the paper we show that actually, if you're just trying to look at market aggregates, so what does this demand model predict effective tax has on consumption in total? The normal distribution version doesn't do a very bad job. It's actually approximately right. But it really matters when you start being interested in individual people and how the effect of the tax affects different types of people with different characteristics. Because then it really matters which part of the distribution they're on and the way these things are correlated. And that's really not captured well in the random distribution version. Okay, so look at the paper if you're interested in. We can go through looking at how that variation what the distribution of that variation looks like. And the richness of doing this is that we're able to look at this in I'm going to skip the supply model. We're able to do this in we've estimated it non-parametrically, so we're able to look at how this is the reduction in sugar as a result of the tax, how that varies from young people to older people and across, for example, deciles of from people who really don't consume that much sugar to people who consume a lot of sugar. So what you can see, for example, is that the tax, so who do we really want to be affected most by this policy? One is people who consume a lot of sugar. Actually, these bars are on the whole lower than those bars. That's because these people have very strong preferences for sugar. They consume a lot of sugar, that's because they really like sugar. This is consume a lot of sugar not only in soda, but in all goods. So the bad news is that the policy is not very well targeted because it's really leading to big reductions in sugar consumption, not in the big target group we care about, but in the other group. The good news is it leads to bigger reductions amongst young people than it does amongst old people. Young people are on the whole more price sensitive, and while they have strong preferences for sugar, those are highly correlated with strong distaste for price. They're poorer on average, and so they tend to substitute away more. And so we can also look at this with respect to income and with other characteristics if we want to gain a much better picture. So here we have less strong evidence on where the high externalities and internalities are coming from. But we can use this evidence to then think about, well, where do we think that's likely? And this is these are the people that we want to affect the most. We're affecting this group, but not so much this group. And so that's what that says: larger reductions amongst the young, and amongst the low income, but not so much those that have overall high sugar consumption. So ex ante, if we'd had a really clear idea of what we wanted to capture, we could probably specify a set of random coefficients that would allow us to capture that variation. But without knowing that ex ante, we'd have trouble doing that. And so this allows us to much more flexible, and we wouldn't know that the distributional assumptions we made were having a big effect or not. So this allows us to much more flexibly capture that correlation. Okay, so I'm gonna just get to conclusion. So the relative effect of lowering of a sugar tax has been to lower the sugar intake of young consumers because they buy more of the tax good and they respond more strongly because of the price effect. But it's really not very well targeted at lowering sugar intake of those who have a lot of sugar in their diet, particularly adults that are heavy consumers of sugar. And the results are somewhat larger than, I'll just skip that. Yeah. So overall what I tried to show in those two papers was that when we're trying to think about the impact of a tax, it's really important that we think about what the objective of the tax is and that we specify the demand system 1 in order to allow us to capture the heterogeneity and to allow us to understand who was affected and how that correlates with the objective of the policy, and 2, that we specify the demand system with enough flexibility that we don't impose from the structure that we put down the way that prices will feed through into aggregate demand. So if we estimate a really restricted demand system, we may not be allowing people to substitute between products in a flexible way or substitute in other dimensions. So it's very important that we think about that kind of flexibility. So in the second lecture, we're going to talk about thinking about the effects of advertising and restrictions to advertising and similar kind of related issues. We'll think a bit more about the supply side. And then in the third lecture, we're going to put the two together and think about what happens if we have taxes and advertising restrictions together. And there's going to be some tricky things there because then that introduces some supply side dynamics that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. Good. Yep.
On the last picture that you showed, it seems like an income effect maybe that you target so much better for young people and not for older people.
Well, I didn't show that with income. There is a picture with income.
I'm just saying, based on this, it feels like an income effect to me. Can taxation even attack the income effect problem, or like should we be thinking about other types of levers to have the same type of effect in like older age groups? Because I don't know the income effect plot. Like maybe it looks different, but this just looks like it's an income effect.
It's not though. It's driven by, here it's not at all driven by an income effect, it's driven by preference parameters. It's driven by the fact that the correlation between preferences for sugar and sensitivity to price. So if you're calling a different sensitivity to price an income effect.
No, so if you look at the youngest age group versus the oldest age group, it looks like it's in the youngest age group you're able to reduce consumption in the higher deciles of added sugar, and in the oldest age group you're not.
Yeah.
And to me that just feels like old people have a higher amount of income or control over income.
But that's not what I'm capturing here. So that's not what this is driven by in this picture. So I'm not saying that could be true, but that's not what's driven here, what's happening here.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is, looking at this, my guess is that this gap between old and young people is due to income effects. So in your income effect plot, is it due to income effects mainly?
No. No, but this wouldn't add, so it depends on what you mean by income effects. So you have to be a bit careful by what you mean by income effects. So there isn't really an income effect here. This is a very small good, so you're not changing. So in a demand model, you would often include income to allow there to be an elasticity of demand with respect to income. There's no income effects in any of these demand models. This is a very small ticket item, so the income effects are going to be negligible. If what you mean is heterogeneity and preferences across the income distribution, that's not an income effect, that's just heterogeneity and preferences across. Yeah, no, so there's no income. So it's unusual to include income effects in discrete choice demand models. You can. I have a paper on that, good, exactly, but this costs 50p. So like raising 50p to 52p, the effect on people's income is pretty small, right? So there are no income effects here at all.
That's not obvious to me because it may be true, but I'm just saying it's not obvious to me because you would presume that income effects do play a role, for example, with alcohol purchases.
Absolutely, with alcohol purchases, it would be much better to include them. I agree with you. So here, for soda, this is a can of soda. I think income effects are pretty small. Again, it would depend on what income. So disposable income of a young person, maybe it's a bigger part. Yeah. No. So that's a good question, so it's almost entirely the case that these models don't have income effects in them. I do have a paper in Corrective Economics with Lars Nisam where we do think about what the income effects matter here, whether they matter or not, and they could. That is not what's driving it here. There is heterogeneity in preferences that's correlated with income, but that's a different thing than an income effect.
I can just think as like older people are just
They have stronger sugar preferences, yeah. If you want to call that, I wouldn't call that addiction, but it's, yeah, as a shorthand you could call it. They have stronger sugar preferences. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, but that's a great question. That's, yeah.
Okay, if not, we have lunch outside, and lecture 2 will resume at 1:30. So please help yourself. And, Rachel,
Yeah, I'm around all day, so thanks.
Just a quick question that I just want to ask the lecture, because I won't be here for the second. But do you know? I'm sure you know the paper by Jonathan Gruber, because I work on happiness.
Yeah.
And you know the cigarette tax.
Yeah.
Actually raises the happiness of people who are the likely smokers.
Yeah, because it's a commitment device.
Yeah. So it's a self-control problem. Is there any studies on this sort of taxes as well?
Not that I know of, on happiness. I don't know.
I mean, I would be interested to explore that kind of thing.
But I guess you really need to think about what happiness you mean there. So what I will talk about in the next one is so decision utility versus experience utility. So when you